The signal came through broken and weak, like a voice calling from the bottom of a well that had no end. Commander Elena Rose sat in the cockpit of her tiny research vessel, the Wren, and watched the words scroll across the screen in front of her. And at first she did not understand what she was reading, because the words did not make any sense. They could not make any sense, because what they described was not something that could happen in a universe that still had rules. Species-wide extinction event confirmed. The Concord news beacon repeated in its cold and mechanical tone. Human population across all 40 colonized systems has been reduced to zero within 90 standard days. Cause attributed to biological agent designated Ashen Tide. Concord of 12 has declared humanity officially extinct and has begun redistribution of formerly human-held territories. Elena read the message again. Then she read it a third time. She sat very still in her chair and stared at the screen, and the hum of the Wren's engines filled the silence around her. And outside the cockpit window the stars burned in the black the way they always had, unchanged and uncaring. And she thought about her daughter Maya, who lived on the colony world of Thesson 4 with her grandmother. And she thought about the way Maya used to laugh when Elena would lift her up and spin her around in the kitchen of their small apartment. And she thought about the last message Maya had sent her, a drawing of a bird with too many wings, and the words, "Come home soon, Mama," written in crooked letters at the bottom. That message was 47 days old now. Elena pressed her hands flat against the console, and they did not shake, and she did not cry, and she did not scream, and she sat there in the silence of the ship that suddenly felt like a coffin drifting through the emptiest part of space that any human had ever reached. And she was alone in a way that no human being had ever been alone before, because there was no one left, not on Earth, not on Thesson 4, not on any of the 40 worlds that humanity had called home. And the weight of that understanding settled onto her shoulders like a mountain made of grief. She closed her eyes. She opened them again. "Okay," she said to the empty cockpit, and her voice was steady and quiet and did not break. The Wren was a survey ship, small and old and built for mapping the edges of uncharted space, and it carried no weapons and no soldiers and no great technology, just scientific instruments and a fabrication unit, and the supplies needed to keep one person alive for long-duration missions in deep space. And Elena had been out here for nearly 5 months, cataloging a cluster of dead stars at the far edge of known space. So far from civilization that even the Concord's communication relays barely reached her. That distance had saved her life. The Ashen Tide, whatever it was, had swept through every human world with terrible speed, and the reports that Elena was able to piece together from broken transmissions and corrupted data files painted a picture that made her stomach turn. The plague had appeared simultaneously on every human colony on the same day at the same hour, and it had targeted human DNA with a precision that no natural disease could ever achieve. And within 90 days, 38 billion people were dead, and the colonies went dark one by one like candles being blown out by a wind that had no mercy. Elena spent 3 days reading every fragment of data she could pull from the corrupted beacons, and she did not sleep during those 3 days, and she ate only when her hands began to shake too badly to type, and she built a picture of what had happened, not just the plague itself, but the response to it, or rather the lack of response, because the Concord of 12, the great alliance of elder civilizations that had governed the galaxy for over 100,000 years, had done nothing to help. They had watched. They had waited. And when it was over, they had moved in to take what humanity had built, dividing up human worlds and human stations and human technology among themselves like scavengers, picking clean a body that was still warm. The Concord of 12 had always made Elena uneasy, even when humanity had been welcomed into its ranks just 200 years ago. The elder species were ancient and powerful, and they moved through the galaxy with the slow confidence of beings who had seen civilizations rise and fall 1,000 times, and they had looked at humanity the way a gardener might look at a weed that had somehow grown taller than the flowers, with surprise, and then with concern, and then with something that was not quite fear but lived very close to it. Because humanity had risen fast, faster than any species in conquered history. In just 300 years, humans had gone from their first faster-than-light jump to colonizing 40 star systems, and they had reverse-engineered conquered technology and then improved upon it. And they had begun to innovate in ways that the elder species had never seen, creating new forms of energy and new methods of travel and new approaches to problems that the conquered had considered solved for millennia. And the elders had smiled their careful smiles and said the right words about cooperation and shared progress. But behind those smiles, something darker had been growing. Elena found the proof on the fourth day. It came in the form of a classified conquered transmission that had been bouncing through the relay network, encrypted with protocols that were never meant to be broken by human hands. But Elena was a survey officer trained in signal analysis and deep space communication, and she had spent 5 months alone with nothing but her instruments and her mind, and she cracked the encryption in 6 hours. What she found inside made the grief in her chest harden into something else entirely, something cold and sharp and very, very patient. The transmission was a record of a closed session of the Conquered's ruling council, and it contained the voices of 3 species, the Valith, the Draman, and the Thurani, and they were discussing the Ashen Tide not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a project to be evaluated. And the Valith delegate spoke in smooth and measured tones about acceptable timelines for species removal, and the Draman delegate referenced genetic targeting efficiency, and the Thurani delegate congratulated the others on what it called a clean solution to the human deviation. The genocide had been planned. It had been designed in laboratories and debated in council chambers and approved by a vote, and the 3 most powerful species in the conquered had looked at humanity, at 38 billion living, breathing, dreaming people, and had decided that they were a problem to be solved, a threat to be eliminated, a deviation from galactic equilibrium that could not be allowed to continue. Elena listened to the transmission 3 times, and each time her jaw tightened a little more, and each time the cold, sharp thing inside her chest grew a little larger. And when she was done, she sat in her cockpit and looked at the photograph of Maya that she kept taped to the console, Maya with her messy hair and her gap-toothed smile, and her drawing of a bird with too many wings. And she understood with perfect clarity that her daughter had not died from a plague. Her daughter had been murdered. They had all been murdered, every mother and father and child, every artist and farmer and soldier, every laughing voice and crying baby and old man watching the sunset on a world he had helped to build, all of them murdered by beings who had smiled at them and called them allies, and then killed them in their sleep, because they were afraid of what humanity might become. Elena reached out and touched the photograph with the tip of her finger, and she traced the outline of her daughter's face, and the cold, sharp thing inside her chest was not rage, not yet. It was something deeper and quieter and far more dangerous. It was purpose. She stood up from her chair and walked to the navigation console and began to chart a course back toward human space, toward the dead worlds and the silent stations, and whatever was left of everything her species had ever built. And she did not know yet what she would do when she got there, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They thought they had killed every human. They were wrong. And that mistake, that single oversight, that one tiny survey ship too far out and too small and too insignificant to bother with, was going to cost them everything they had built over 100,000 years. The last human was alive, and she was not afraid. The first dead world Elena visited was Korath 7, a mining colony that had once been home to 12 million people. And when the Wren dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the planet appeared on her screen, she had to grip the edges of her console to stop herself from looking away. The cities were dark. Every light that had once burned on the surface was gone, and from orbit the planet looked the way it must have looked before humans ever touched it, empty and silent and waiting for something that would never come again. And Elena stared at it for a long time before she guided her ship down through the atmosphere and landed on the outskirts of what had once been the colony's capital city. She did not go into the city itself. She could see it from where she landed, the towers and the domes and the wide streets that had been built by human hands, all of it standing perfectly intact because the ashen tide had not destroyed buildings or machines or anything made of steel and glass. It had only destroyed the people, and that somehow made it worse, because the city looked like it was waiting for its inhabitants to come back, like they had all just stepped out for a moment and would return any minute now. And the emptiness of it was so heavy that Elena could feel it pressing against her chest like a physical weight. She found what she was looking for at a military research station on the edge of the colony, a heavily shielded underground facility that the conquered scavengers had not yet reached, and she spent 2 days cutting through the blast doors with the Wren's mining laser before she finally broke through into the corridors below. The station was a graveyard. The researchers were still at their desks, still in their chairs, still holding the tools they had been working with when the ashen tide took them, and Elena walked past them with her jaw set tight and her eyes focused straight ahead because she could not afford to look at their faces, not now, not yet, because if she started mourning each one of them individually she would never stop, and she had work to do. What she found in the station's central data core made the journey worth every second of pain. Project Ember. It was a classified military program that the Human Defense Council had been developing in secret, a program so advanced and so dangerous that only a handful of people in the entire species had known about it, and it had been designed as a last resort, a weapon that would only be used if humanity faced total annihilation, and the bitter irony of finding it now, too late to save anyone, was not lost on Elena. But it was not too late for everything. Project Ember was a system of adaptive nano-warfare microscopic machines that could interface with any technology, disrupt any energy shield, and rebuild themselves from almost nothing. And the research team had completed nearly 80% of the work before the ashen tide killed them. And the remaining 20% involved problems of integration and power management that the team had been struggling with for months. Elena sat down at a dead researcher's workstation and pulled up the files and began to read, and she read for 3 days straight, absorbing everything the team had done and everything they had failed to do, and on the 4th day she began to work. She was not a weapons engineer. She was a survey officer, a scientist trained in deep space analysis and signal processing and the mapping of stellar phenomena. But she was also human, and humans had always been the species that could take knowledge from one field and apply it to another in ways that no one expected. And the problems that had stumped the Ember research team were problems of signal coordination and adaptive feedback. And those were problems that Elena had spent her entire career solving in a different context. She worked alone in that underground station for 4 months. She talked to herself while she worked, not because she was losing her mind, but because the silence was so complete and so crushing that she needed to hear a human voice even if it was only her own. And sometimes she talked to Maya's photograph, which she had propped up on the workstation beside her, telling her daughter about what she was building and why she was building it, and promising her that it would matter, that all of it would matter. The loneliness was a living thing that wrapped itself around her and squeezed, and there were nights when she lay on the cold floor of the station and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of being the last of her kind pressing down on her like an ocean. And she would close her eyes and remember the sound of Maya's laughter and the smell of coffee in the morning on Thesson 4 and the feeling of standing in a crowd of people and knowing that she was part of something larger than herself. And all of those memories were knives now. Beautiful and terrible and sharp enough to cut her open from the inside. But every morning she got up and went back to work. Because grief without purpose was just suffering, and Elena Rowe had decided that she would not simply suffer, she would build. And she built something extraordinary. She completed Project Ember alone, one woman doing what an entire team of specialists had not been able to finish. And she used the station's fabrication systems to construct what she called the mantle. A suit of adaptive nano-armor that covered her body like a second skin, and responded to her thoughts, and could interface with any computer system or energy network within range. And it could harden against projectile weapons and absorb directed energy, and repair itself from damage that would destroy conventional armor. And it was the most advanced piece of technology that any human had ever created. She also rebuilt the Wren. Using salvaged components from the station and materials she stripped from abandoned conquered equipment that the scavengers had left behind, she transformed her little survey ship into something new, something that still looked small and harmless from the outside, but carried stealth systems adapted from conquered cloaking technology and offensive capabilities that would make a warship captain nervous, and every modification she made carried the fingerprints of human ingenuity. That strange and wonderful ability to look at a problem and see not what was there, but what could be there. When she was finished, she stood in the hangar bay of the underground station and looked at what she had made, the mantle hanging on its rack, the Wren sitting on the landing pad with its new systems humming quietly, and she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, it was too late for hope, but something close to it, something fierce and stubborn and burning, like the last ember of a fire that refused to go out no matter how much darkness surrounded it. She recorded a message before she left. She sat in the Wren's cockpit wearing the mantle, and she looked directly into the camera, and her face was thin and scarred from months of hard work and harder grief, but her eyes were steady and clear, and she spoke in a voice that did not waver. "My name is Elena Rowe," she said. "I am a commander in the Human Survey Corps, and I am the last living member of my species, the last of 38 billion people who were murdered by the Valith, the Draman, and the Thurani, with the knowledge and silence of the conquered of 12. She paused and let the words settle. "You killed my species because you were afraid of what we could do," she continued. "You looked at us and saw how fast we learned and how quickly we grew and how we took your technology and made it better, and you were afraid, and you were right to be afraid." Another pause. "But you should have been more thorough." She ended the recording and uploaded it to the Wren's communication array, and she programmed the ship to broadcast it on every open conquered frequency, every military channel, every diplomatic band, every public news relay, so that every species in the galaxy would hear it at the same time. Then she launched the Wren out of the hangar and into the sky of the dead world, and as the planet shrank behind her, she pressed the transmit button. The message went out at the speed of light, spreading across the galaxy like a ripple in a pond, and it carried with it a simple and terrifying truth that the conquered had never expected to face. One human had survived. One human had built herself into a weapon. And one human was coming for them. Across the galaxy, in the towering council chambers of the conquered, the Valith delegate received the transmission and felt something that its species had not felt in 10,000 years. A cold tremor at the base of its spine that its people had almost forgotten the name for. It was fear. And it was just the beginning. The broadcast hit the conquered like a hammer striking glass, and the cracks spread in every direction. In the great council chamber of the conquered, a structure the size of a small moon that floated in the neutral space between star systems, 12 delegations received Elena's message at the same moment, and for 17 seconds no one spoke, and those 17 seconds were the longest silence in the history of an alliance that had governed the galaxy for 100,000 years. The Valith delegate was the first to move, rising from its chair with the fluid grace of a species that had evolved in low gravity, and its skin shifted from calm silver to agitated violet as it addressed the council in a voice that tried very hard to sound composed. "This is clearly a fabrication," it said, "a rogue signal designed to cause disruption. The human species is extinct, and this recording is nothing more than a desperate trick created by their automated systems before the end." But even as it spoke, the data analysts in every delegation were running their own checks on the transmission, and every single one of them came back with the same result. The message was real. The voice pattern matched Commander Elena Rowe of the Human Survey Corps, and the signal originated from a location deep inside what had been human-controlled space. The Draman delegate, a massive creature encased in biological armor that its species grew from their own bodies, slammed one of its 4 fists against the council table and demanded an immediate military response. And the Thureni delegate, thin and pale, and radiating the cold intelligence that made its species the finest strategists in the conquered, quietly agreed and began transmitting orders to its fleet commanders before the council had even voted. Within 6 hours, 3 hunter fleets were launched, one from each of the conspirator species, comprising over 200 warships with a single mission: find the last human and end her. But the cracks in the conquered were already spreading. The Ilvari delegate, ancient even by elder species standards, its body a living lattice of crystalline structures that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, stood and spoke for the first time in decades, and its voice resonated through the chamber like a bell being struck in a cathedral. "We knew," it said simply. "We did not vote for the Ashen Tide, but we knew it was coming and we said nothing, and our silence makes us as guilty as those who designed it. I will carry that shame for the rest of my existence, and I suspect it will outlive me." The Ilvari's words broke something open in the council, and suddenly delegations that had been silent for months began to speak, and the voices that filled the chamber were angry and frightened and confused, and the conquered that had held together for 100,000 years began to tear at its seams. The Korvathi delegate stood last. The Korvathi were a warrior species, tall and broad and covered in natural plate armor that made them look like they had been carved from stone, and they had always respected humanity in a way that the other elder species never had, because the Korvathi understood what it meant to fight and to build and to refuse to surrender. And they had seen those same qualities in the young species that had burst onto the galactic stage with such incredible speed. The Korvathi ambassador looked around the council chamber at the arguing delegates, and then looked directly at the Valith representative, and spoke in a voice like gravel being crushed. "You exterminated a species for the crime of being too capable," it said, "and the lone survivor just proved you right. I will not hunt her. I am not that foolish." And with that, the Korvathi delegation walked out of the council chamber, and 3 other species followed them, and the conquered's unity shattered like thin ice under a heavy boot. Elena knew none of this, not yet, but she did not need to know it, because she had already begun her campaign, and it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. She did not attack with fire and fury, the way the conquered expected. She attacked with precision and with patience, and with a kind of cold creativity that left her enemies confused and humiliated and deeply, deeply afraid. Her first target was the Valith dreadnought Serenes, a warship half a kilometer long that was leading the hunt for her, and she found it patrolling the outer edges of the quarantine zone around human space, and she did not fire a single shot at it. Instead, she used the mantle's nanosystems to infiltrate the ship's computer network through a maintenance relay. And in the space of 4 minutes, she rewrote the ship's weapon control protocols, so that every gun and missile launcher on the vessel locked itself in a permanent safety mode that could not be overridden without a complete systems rebuild. The Serenes, the most powerful warship in the Valith fleet, was reduced to an expensive and very large paperweight, and its captain had to request a tow back to port, and the shame of it burned through the Valith military command like acid. Her second target was more ambitious. The Draman maintained a central intelligence station on a moon called Vekath, a facility where they stored their most sensitive communications and strategic data, and Elena spent 2 weeks studying its defenses before she made her move, slipping through their sensor network in the Wren's cloaked configuration and landing on the moon's surface in a crater less than a kilometer from the station's outer wall. She breached the station alone on foot, wearing the mantle, moving through corridors and past security systems with a speed and adaptability that the Draman's automated defenses were not designed to handle, because the defenses had been built to counter the tactics of known species and human tactics, especially the tactics of a human with nothing left to lose and everything to prove, were something entirely outside their experience. She did not kill anyone inside the station. She did not need to. She accessed the central data core and downloaded everything, every communication, every strategic plan, every classified document, including the complete and detailed records of how the Ashen Tide had been planned and developed and deployed, with names and dates and authorization codes, and the full text of the council vote that had condemned 38 billion people to death. Then she broadcast all of it, every file, every record, every damning word on every open channel in the galaxy. And within hours, every species in the Conquered had access to proof that the genocide of humanity had been a deliberate and calculated act approved at the highest levels of 3-member civilizations. The galaxy erupted. Species that had been uncertain before were now furious, and diplomatic channels overloaded with accusations and demands and threats, and the Valith and Draman and Thurani found themselves isolated and defensive, scrambling to justify actions that could not be justified, and the careful political structures that had protected them for millennia began to crumble. But Elena was not finished. Her third strike was aimed at the Thurani, the coldest and most calculating of the 3 conspirators, and it was her masterpiece. The Thurani homeworld was protected by a planetary defense grid, a network of orbital weapons platforms that could destroy an entire fleet before it got within firing range, and it was the pride of Thurani engineering, a system so advanced and so secure that no species in the galaxy had ever attempted to breach it. Elena breached it in 9 hours. She did not destroy it and she did not disable it. Instead, she did something far more devastating to a species that prided itself on control and perfection. She reprogrammed the orbital platforms to rearrange their positions, and when the Thurani looked up at their own defense grid from the surface of their homeworld, they saw that the platforms had been moved to spell a single word in orbital positioning, a human word written across their sky in letters made of their own weapons. Remember. The Thurani government went silent for 3 full days after that, and when they finally spoke again, their voice had lost the cold confidence that had defined them for 10,000 years. Elena made contact with the Ilvari during this time, a secret communication channel that the crystalline species established through back channels that even the Conquered could not monitor, and the Ilvari envoy asked her what she wanted, what her endgame was, what she was trying to achieve with this campaign of humiliation and exposure. Elena's answer was simple and quiet, and carried a weight that made the Ilvari envoy fall silent for a long time after hearing it. "I am not trying to destroy them," she said. "I am trying to make sure that no one ever forgets what they did and what we were." The Ilvari envoy considered this, and then asked the question that had been haunting every species in the galaxy since the broadcast. What happens when they stop trying to catch you and start trying to kill everything around you instead? Elena did not answer right away, and when she did, her voice was flat and tired, and carried the weight of a grief that had been compressed into something harder than diamond. "Then I will stop being gentle," she said. The Ilvari envoy believed her. The conspirators believed her too, and their fear grew into desperation, and desperation made them do what desperate powers always do. They reached for the biggest weapon they could find. The Axiom Protocol. It was a Conquered-era superweapon, a device capable of sterilizing an entire star system, burning away every planet and moon and asteroid until nothing remained but empty space and the ghosts of everything that had once been there. And it had not been activated in 60,000 years, because no threat had ever been deemed severe enough to justify its use. Until now. The Valith and Draman and Thurani activated the Axiom Protocol and aimed it at the last known coordinates of the Wren, and they were willing to burn an entire region of space, hundreds of cubic light-years of stars and worlds and everything living within them, to kill one single human being. And across the galaxy, in the cockpit of her small and battered ship, Elena Rowe received the intelligence from her Korvathi contacts and looked at the data and understood what was coming. She looked at Maya's photograph. She looked at the stars. And she began to plan the impossible. The Axiom Protocol was housed inside a station the size of a city, orbiting a dead star in the heart of Thurani space, and it was surrounded by the combined fleets of 3 civilizations. 400 warships arranged in layered defensive formations that covered every approach vector and every possible angle of attack. And behind those ships, the station itself bristled with weapon platforms and shield generators and sensor arrays so sensitive that they could detect a grain of sand moving at 1,000 kilometers away. It was the most heavily defended location in the galaxy, and Elena was going to fly straight into it. She sat in the Wren's cockpit and studied the tactical data that the Korvathi had secretly transmitted to her, detailed maps of the Thurani defense corridors, patrol schedules, sensor blind spots, and the locations of every ship in the combined fleet. And she ran the numbers over and over again in her head, and every time she ran them the answer came back the same. The odds of reaching the station alive were almost zero. The odds of reaching the station alive and disabling the Axiom Protocol and getting out again were so far below zero that mathematics did not have a useful way to express them. Elena looked at those numbers and she felt something that surprised her, not fear, though fear was certainly there, coiled in her stomach like a cold snake, but something quieter and sadder, a kind of gentle acceptance that settled over her like a blanket, because she understood that this was probably the end of her story and the end of humanity's story, and she found that she was at peace with that, as long as the ending meant something. She was not afraid to die. She was afraid of dying for nothing. She transmitted a coded message to the Ilvari through the secret channel, and she did not ask for much, just 12 minutes of communications jamming across the Thurani sector, enough time for her to slip through the outer defense perimeter before the fleet could coordinate a response. And the Ilvari envoy was silent for a very long time before responding. "You understand that if we do this and you fail, the Thurani will know we helped you, and they will turn the Axiom Protocol on us next." "I understand," Elena replied. "And you believe you can succeed, one person in one ship against 400 warships, and a station that was built to withstand the assault of entire civilizations." "I do not believe I can succeed," Elena said, and her honesty was so raw and so human that the Ilvari envoy felt something shift inside its crystalline body, something it had no name for. "I believe I have to try." The Ilvari agreed to help. The Korvathi went further. Their ambassador contacted Elena directly, breaking every protocol and risking everything, and the old warrior looked at her through the communication screen with eyes that held a respect so deep it bordered on reverence. "I have studied your species for 200 years, the Korvathi ambassador said, "and I have never understood how beings so small and so fragile could be so terrifying. But I think I understand now. It is because you do not stop. You do not ever stop." "No," Elena agreed quietly, "we do not." "Then fly well, Commander Rowe, and if you fall, know that the Korvathi will remember your name for as long as our species endures." Elena nodded once and closed the channel and took a deep breath that filled her lungs with recycled air that tasted of metal and exhaustion, and she looked at Maya's photograph one more time and touched it gently with her fingertip the way she always did. And then she fired the Wren's engines and set course for the dead star. She arrived at the edge of the Thureni defense perimeter 14 hours later, and she waited in the dark with all systems powered down except life support and the passive sensors, and the Wren drifted like a piece of debris, cold and silent and invisible, while Elena watched the fleet's patrol patterns and counted the seconds until the moment the Ilvari had promised. At exactly the agreed time, every communication relay in the Thureni sector went dead. The jamming was total and instantaneous, and for 12 precious minutes, the 400 warships of the combined fleet were unable to coordinate with each other or with the Axiom station. And in that window of chaos and confusion, Elena powered the Wren's engines to maximum and dove straight into the defense corridor that the Korvathi had mapped for her. The ship moved like nothing the Thureni had ever seen, fast and unpredictable, and so close to the hulls of enemy warships that their weapons could not track her without risking hitting each other. And the Wren twisted and rolled and slipped through gaps in the formation that should not have been large enough for a ship to pass through. But Elena flew with the desperate precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear except failure. The first ships to react fired blind, and their shots went wide, and some of them struck other ships in the fleet, and the confusion multiplied as damaged vessels broke formation, and the carefully layered defense began to collapse under its own weight. Elena did not slow down. She pushed the Wren through the outer ring and the middle ring and into the inner defense zone where the heaviest ships waited, and here the fire became thick and accurate, and the Wren took hits, glancing blows that stripped away armor plating and shattered secondary systems, and filled the cockpit with sparks and the shriek of stressed metal. But the ship held together because Elena had rebuilt it with human ingenuity and human stubbornness, and it held together just long enough. She reached the Axiom station. The Wren crashed through the station's outer docking bay at full speed, tearing through the entrance like a bullet through paper, and the ship's forward section crumpled on impact, and the engines died and half the systems went dark. But Elena was already moving out of her seat, into the mantle, through the shattered hull, and onto the station's deck before the dust of her own arrival had settled. The station's interior defenses activated immediately, automated weapons platforms and security drones and force fields that snapped into place across corridors, and Elena ran through all of it with the mantle's nanosystems working at full capacity, interfacing with the station's networks, and turning its own defenses against itself. And she moved with a speed and ferocity that was beyond anything the station's designers had anticipated, because they had designed their defenses to stop armies. Not a single human being who had learned to fight the way water fights rock, not with force but with persistence, finding every crack and flowing through it. She was wounded in the third corridor, a security drone's plasma bolt that punched through a gap in the mantle's coverage and burned a furrow across her left side that went deep enough to expose bone, and she stumbled but did not fall, and she kept running. And the blood that dripped behind her left a trail on the station's pristine white floors. She was wounded again in the fifth corridor, a force field that collapsed too slowly and caught her right arm, crushing the armor plating and breaking the bones beneath. And she screamed but did not stop, and she cradled her shattered arm against her body and kept moving forward because forward was the only direction that mattered. The mantle was failing, its nanoreserves depleted from constant combat and self-repair, its systems flickering and dimming, and Elena could feel it dying around her the way you feel a fire dying when the last logs burn low, and she knew she did not have much time. She reached the core. The Axiom Protocol's heart was a massive chamber filled with energy conduits and control systems that hummed with enough power to sterilize a star system. And it was beautiful in a terrible way, all light and energy, and the promise of absolute destruction. And Elena staggered into the chamber and fell to her knees, and looked at the weapon that was meant to finish what the Ashen Tide had started. It was counting down. She could see the timer on the central display. Less than 90 seconds until the weapon fired, and an entire region of space was reduced to nothing. And she pulled herself to the nearest control terminal and tried to access the system with her one working hand. And the mantle's interface reached out to connect with the station's network. But the encryption was too deep, and the security too layered, and she could not break through in time. She had less than 60 seconds. Elena closed her eyes and understood what she had to do, and a strange calm washed over her, not peace exactly, but something like it, something that felt like the quiet at the center of a storm. She could overload the mantle's entire remaining nanoreserve into the station's power core, every microscopic machine, every last fragment of energy, and the cascade would destroy the Axiom Protocol's control systems from the inside. But it would also destroy the mantle completely and probably kill her in the process. She reached into the suit's interface with her mind and found the emergency overload command, and she held it there, ready to trigger. And before she did, she reached into her suit's chest compartment with her broken hand and pulled out the photograph of Maya, crumpled and stained with her own blood, and she looked at her daughter's face one last time. "I carried us as far as I could, baby," she whispered, and her voice broke on the last word the way it had not broken during all the months of grief and loneliness and rage. She pressed the trigger. The mantle screamed, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out at once, and every nanomachine in the suit launched itself into the station's power core in a blinding wave of light, and the cascade ripped through the Axiom Protocol systems like fire through dry grass, and the control displays shattered, and the energy conduits burst, and the weapon that was meant to burn the stars themselves died in a shower of sparks and failing light. The explosion threw Elena across the chamber and into a wall, and she felt things break inside her body, ribs and something deeper. And the world went white and then gray, and then very nearly black. The station's emergency systems kicked in and the core went dark, and the countdown stopped at 4 seconds. And in the sudden silence, Elena lay on the floor of the dead chamber in a shattered suit, with blood pooling beneath her, and the photograph of her daughter still clutched in her broken hand. Outside, the combined fleet watched their sensors in disbelief, as the Axiom station's power signature flatlined, and the weapon went permanently offline. And from the wreckage, faint and flickering and impossibly stubborn, a single life sign persisted on every scanner in the system. The last human was still alive, barely breathing, broken in more places than she could count, lying in a pool of her own blood in the heart of a dead weapon, but alive. Still alive. The Korvathi warship Stoneheart broke formation before anyone gave it permission to move, and its captain, a scarred veteran named Voreth who had fought in more battles than most species had recorded in their histories, guided the massive vessel through the confused and leaderless fleet with the calm certainty of someone who had already made peace with whatever consequences were coming. "Open the docking bay," Voreth ordered. "Captain," the first officer said carefully, "the conquered fleet will consider this an act of—" "Open the docking bay," Voreth repeated, and there was something in the old warrior's voice that left no room for argument. The Stoneheart extended its retrieval arms into the shattered hull of the Axiom station and pulled out a single body, broken and burned and wrapped in the remnants of armor that had once been the most advanced technology humanity had ever created. And when the medical team brought Elena Rowe aboard and laid her on the table in the ship's emergency bay, Voreth stood at the door and looked at her, and saw something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to others. She was so small. That was what struck him most, how impossibly small she was compared to the thing she had just done, this fragile creature with her soft skin and her thin bones and her single heart that was still beating despite every reason it had to stop. And Voreth had fought enemies 10 times her size, and had never felt what he felt standing in that doorway looking at the last human being in existence. It was not pity. It was awe. The Korvathi doctors worked on Elena for 11 hours, and 3 times during those hours her heart stopped, and 3 times they brought her back. And Voreth stood at the door the entire time because the Korvathi had a tradition. When a warrior of extraordinary courage was fighting for their life, another warrior would stand guard and refuse to leave until the battle was decided. And Voreth had decided that this human had earned that honor more than anyone he had ever known. Elena survived. She woke 3 days later in a bed that was too large for her body because it had been built for Korvathi proportions. And the first thing she saw was Voreth sitting in a chair beside her bed, absurdly large for a chair, even by Korvathi standards. And he was holding something in his massive stone-plated hand with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for a being of his size. It was the photograph of Maya. "It was in your hand when we found you," Voreth said in his deep, gravelly voice. "You would not let go of it, even unconscious. Even dying, your fingers would not release it. We had to wait until you woke." Elena took the photograph from him and held it against her chest and closed her eyes. And she did not speak for a long time, and Voreth did not ask her to. The galaxy changed in the days and weeks that followed. The destruction of the Axiom Protocol, combined with the classified files that Elena had already leaked to every species in the Conquered, created a wave of outrage and upheaval that no political structure could withstand. And the Conquered of 12, which had governed the galaxy for 100,000 years, collapsed in on itself like a star that had finally burned through the last of its fuel. The Valith delegation was expelled first, their representative escorted from the council chamber by Korvathi guards who made no effort to hide their contempt, and the Draman followed within days, their biological armor bristling with agitation as they retreated to their home systems to face the judgment of their own people. The Thureni held on the longest, because the Thureni always held on the longest, but even their cold and calculating minds could not find a strategy to survive what had happened. And when the evidence of their role in the genocide was presented in full before the remaining council members, every communication, every authorization, every clinical discussion of acceptable human mortality rates, the Thureni delegate sat in silence for a very long time, and then simply stood and walked out without saying a word. War crime tribunals began, the first in Conquered history, and the proceedings were broadcast across every system in the galaxy, and billions of beings from dozens of species watched as the architects of the Ashen Tide were called to account for what they had done. And the testimony went on for months and filled archives that would be studied for generations. The Ilvari, driven by their guilt and their desire to ensure that nothing like the Ashen Tide could ever happen again, proposed a new galactic charter, and they named it the Roe Declaration in honor of the woman who had brought the truth to light. And the charter was simple and absolute. It outlawed species-level warfare in all its forms. It enshrined the right of every civilization to exist regardless of how fast it grew or how threatening its potential might seem to others. And it established a framework for galactic governance built on transparency and accountability, rather than the silent power of elder species. The Roe Declaration passed unanimously among the 9 remaining species. When Elena was well enough to stand, they came to her with offers. The Korvathi offered her a fleet and the resources to establish a new human homeland, and their ambassador spoke with a passion that surprised everyone who knew the normally stoic species, arguing that the galaxy owed humanity a debt that could never be fully repaid, but that they should try anyway. The Ilvari offered her a seat on the new governing council, a permanent place for humanity's voice, even though humanity was now a single person, because they believed that the principles she had fought for deserved representation that would outlast her lifetime. Other species offered territory, technology, genetic research that might one day allow the human species to be rebuilt from preserved DNA samples, possibilities that shimmered on the horizon like distant stars, beautiful and uncertain, and impossibly far away. Elena listened to all of it with patience and gratitude, and then she declined every offer. She was the last human. There was no rebuilding what had been lost, not really, because a species was not just DNA and biology. It was culture and memory, and the million small things that people did every day that made them who they were. The jokes they told and the songs they sang and the way they held their children, and the stories they passed down from one generation to the next. And all of that was gone now, and no amount of genetic engineering could bring it back. What she asked for instead was one thing: a monument. On Earth, beautiful empty Earth, where the cities stood silent and the forests had begun to reclaim the streets, and the oceans washed against shores that no human feet would ever walk again. She asked for a single structure to be built at the place where humanity had first launched itself into the stars. The species of the galaxy built it together. The Korvathi quarried the stone from the mountains of their homeworld, black granite harder than steel, polished until it reflected the stars. And the Ovari designed the structure with the mathematical precision and aesthetic beauty that their crystalline minds excelled at. And a dozen other species contributed what they could, each adding something to the monument that represented their respect for the species that was gone. It was a simple obelisk, tall and black and unadorned, rising from the ground where human rockets had once shaken the earth with their thunder. And on its surface, an inscription was carved in every language that humanity had ever spoken, and every language that the conquered species knew, so that no being who ever stood before it could fail to understand its message. We were here, we mattered, remember us. The dedication ceremony was attended by representatives of every species in the galaxy, and they stood in the grass that had grown over the old launch pads and looked up at the obelisk and the sky beyond it, and many of them wept in whatever way their biology allowed them to weep. The Korvathi began a tradition that day. They assigned their youngest warriors to stand vigil at the monument in rotating shifts, a permanent guard of honor for a species that had no one left to guard it, and they considered the duty to be the highest honor a young Korvathi could receive. Years passed. Elena lived on Earth alone, or as alone as someone could be when alien scholars and diplomats and pilgrims came regularly to visit the monument and to speak with her, wanting to understand what humanity had been, wanting to hear stories about a species that had burned so bright and so brief, and had left such an incredible mark on a galaxy that had tried to erase them. She told them everything she could remember. She told them about human music and human art and human laughter, about the way people fell in love and the way they grieved, and the way they picked themselves up after every fall and kept going, about the stubbornness and the creativity and the beautiful foolish courage that had defined her species from the moment they first looked up at the stars and decided that they would find a way to reach them. She grew old on Earth, in a small house near the monument, and every evening she walked to the obelisk and placed her hand against its cold black surface, and stood there as the sun set over a world that had once been full of voices. One evening, many years after the end of everything and the beginning of something new, a young Korvathi guard who was standing vigil at the monument worked up the courage to speak to her. "Commander Rowe," the young warrior said, and its voice was quiet with respect, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," Elena said. "When you flew into the Axiom station, when you knew you would probably die, were you not afraid?" Elena was quiet for a long time, and the wind moved through the grass around them, and the last light of the sun painted the obelisk in shades of gold and amber. "I was terrified," she said finally, and she smiled, and the smile was old and sad and warm all at the same time. "But I was the last one left, and someone had to make sure the galaxy remembered us. Someone had to make sure our story did not end in the dark with no one watching." She looked up at the obelisk and the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and her hand rested against the stone where the inscription read in letters she could trace from memory. "I was the last human," she said quietly. "It had to be enough, and so I made it enough." The young Korvathi guard looked at this small and aging creature, the last of a species that had terrified the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, and understood for the first time why the elders spoke of humanity with such reverence. It was not because humans were strong, though they were strong in ways that defied their fragile bodies. It was not because they were clever, though their minds had outpaced species that had been thinking for 100,000 years. It was because they simply would not stop. Not when they were outnumbered, not when they were outgunned, not when they were alone in the dark with the entire galaxy against them. They would not stop, and that refusal, that beautiful and stubborn and impossible refusal, was the most terrifying and the most inspiring thing the galaxy had ever witnessed. The stars came out over Earth, and Elena Rose stood beneath them, the last human, old and scarred and alone, and her hand rested on the monument that would outlast her and carry her species' memory into a future they would never see. And it was enough.